Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, December 18th, and Ambassador Chas Freeman is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
Let's get started with what has happened in Russia. The new assassination of a Russian general, which was the highest, the most important figures by far in this conflict in Ukraine that was assassinated by Ukrainians. How do you see the mindset of Ukrainians and why are they doing this, in your opinion?
Well, in normal times, in the past, this would have been clearly seen as an act of terrorism. But unfortunately, international law has been set aside. There is, of course, the precedent during the first Trump administration of the assassination of General Soleimani in Iraq, although he was an Iranian figure. The precedents have been set everywhere. Israel has carried out some over 3,000 political assassinations. And it's not surprising, therefore, that we see this kind of thing going on in Europe between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The problem with breaking the norm against this kind of murder is that whatever is done to others can then be done to you. And the Russian retaliation could take the form, if there will be retaliation, it could take the form of assassinations in Ukraine. So I think this is very problematic and will lead to further erosion in global order.
In your opinion, right now, what's going on in Ukraine and the way that the Biden administration is trying to, in my opinion, escalate the situation, not to de-escalate the situation, do you think that do you see any sort of connection between the Trump administration and the Biden administration? Because recently Donald Trump said that they didn't talk with him, they didn't inform him about the use of ATACMS against Russians, which he was, in his view, was so disappointed about that. How do you see right now? In your opinion, is there any sort of connection between the people who are going to work with Donald Trump, or maybe Donald Trump and the Biden administration?
Well, there is, in the sense that there are a lot of neoconservatives in the outgoing administration and many in the new coming administration. And indeed, we have a situation where the apparent strategy for ending the war in Ukraine that Mr. Trump has entrusted to General retired Kellogg involves escalating the war. The Biden administration very clearly is interested in keeping the war going as long as it's in office, so it can't be blamed for Ukrainian defeat. And that can be blamed on Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, claims to be a peacemaker, but I mentioned earlier the assassination of General Soleimani. It also appears that the new incoming administration plans to attack Iran, unlike the Biden administration, which has been reluctant to join Israel in that. The Trump administration people seem to favor that. And we also have the other remark by President-elect Trump that if the hostages that Hamas holds are not released, there will be an escalation of some sort in Gaza. So I don't know what will happen, but what the two administrations have in common is what is called the blob. That means the establishment in foreign policy in the United States. If anything, Mr. Trump is talking more belligerently than Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden spoke relatively moderately, but acted irresponsibly, in my view. And Mr. Trump is speaking very ferociously. I hope he will be more responsible than Mr. Biden, but at this point, I don't really see any reason to believe that he will be.
Do you think that the case of Ukraine is getting to the point that is known that is not that much important for the blob, for the establishment, for these people who are behind the scene running the show?
Well, it's bound up in the case of Mr. Trump and the people who follow him in the Republican Party with a desire to cut the costs of defending Europe. And that means reducing relationship, the transatlantic commitment to NATO. So he's been very clear. He's prepared to withdraw from NATO if he does not see the Europeans taking up the burden that the United States has carried for now 80 years. You know, the war in Europe, World War II ended in 1944. And yet 80 years later, the United States is still in Europe with bases and responsibility for maintaining order in Europe. And not a few Americans don't believe that is right. So the investment in Ukraine and the expansion of NATO, as opposed to its diminution, offend these people, Mr. Trump, and they would like to end the war. But the question is how to end the war. And we've discussed this before. In my view, any effort to end the war has to be based on the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which created an independent, prosperous, democratic, but neutral Austrian state, and which extended guarantees to Austrian minorities, Hungarians, Slovenes, and others, Italians. They could use their own language to educate their children and to communicate with local government. Something like this has to happen in Ukraine. But to make that happen at this point involves a number of difficulties. First of all, you have to decide where the Ukrainian-Russian border is. The war has changed that border. Earlier, it was changed when there was a referendum in Crimea, and Crimea chose to go to Russia. And the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine clearly have shown a preference for being part of Russia, rather than being part of a very nationalistic and anti-Russian Ukraine. So that's one issue. Another is the question of how you actually end the fighting. And the third is, of course, what is Ukraine's relationship to NATO, and where does it fit in European security architecture? And I don't think the Russians will settle for anything less than what Ukraine actually agreed to at Istanbul in 2022, namely the neutrality of Ukraine under some sort of international guarantee in which Russia would participate, and no NATO membership. And finally, there's the broader issue of European security architecture in general. So I see whatever is going to happen in terms of ending this war, and all wars have to end either in the annihilation of one party or a negotiation. And Ukrainians are not going to be annihilated. Russia doesn't want to annihilate them. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. So there will be a negotiation. And I think it will resemble the Peace of Westphalia, which took 4 years and had multiple forums for negotiation, because the issues are different. The issue of the Ukrainian-Russian border really can only be settled by the two of them. Nobody else has the power to do that. The question of the rights of minorities involves the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and European great powers, as well as the neighboring countries like Hungary and Romania, as well as Russia, who have Hungarian and Romanian speakers in Ukraine whose rights they want to see protected. That's another forum. The question of Ukrainian neutrality involves Russia, the United States, and NATO. And the question of Ukraine's entry into the European Union is yet another issue. And finally, you have the question of U.S. and NATO So I'm sorry, I've got workmen coming into the house. Um, um, but anyway, there is the broader issue of European security architecture, which has to be addressed in a very broad forum. And let me just a minute. Could you kindly close the door? Thank you. So sorry. No, thank you. Anyway, so I live in a very well maintained retirement community, and so I'm very grateful for the workmen, but I wish they hadn't had the wit not to speak so loudly. My apologies. Anyway, so I think the negotiations are likely to be protracted and very, very complicated. And I suspect that the fighting will continue while these negotiations are in progress. That was what happened in Korea in 1950 to 54. And I don't see any reason to expect anything much different in Ukraine. I would love to be proved wrong, because more fighting is going to kill more Ukrainians as well as Russians. And Ukraine has suffered enough. And it really should be relieved of that suffering.
Ambassador, today we had Michael McFaul tweeting that Russia must be defeated. Do you understand what's going on in the mind of these people who are still talking about Russia being defeated? Because there is no, in my opinion, there is no reason to believe that. And what's going on in their mind if you were to draw the picture that is in their mind?
Well, I think actually American primacy or hegemony is on its deathbed. And when people or hegemons are in the process of leaving this earth, expiring, they sometimes have delusions and I think hallucinations. And the idea that there can be any Western victory over Russia in Ukraine is a delusion. Russia has shown not only that it will go to war in order to prevent Ukrainian accession to NATO, but that it, with a rather inelegant start, it has learned how to cope with every weapon system the West has provided to Ukraine. And it is advancing. And if the war does not stop, further Ukrainian territory will definitely be lost. So I think this is delusional. And it also reflects, I'm sorry to say, a residual hubris or overweening pride in the United States. We Americans have a formidable military. There's no doubt about that. It is the most capable of projecting power in the world, although it's turned out that that does not guarantee victory on the battlefield. So the same people who claimed there was going to be, quote, victory, unquote, in Afghanistan, without defining what that might be, are now claiming there could be victory in Ukraine, but there will not be. And I think Mr. McFaul correctly perceives that the days of American hegemony are coming to an end, and he wants to resist that. And of course, most Americans probably are quite happy to be number one in the world. Why not? But if you can't do that, then as Edmund Burke, the famous conservative in the 18th century in Britain, said, the essence of diplomacy is to yield gracefully what you cannot withhold. And I would add, and try to make sure that the other side pays as much as you can get them to do, as much as you can get them to pay, as you accept and make concessions to them. So this is a negotiation. It is not the further supply of so-called wonder weapons, which turn out not to win battles. And Ukraine is at a crucial moment. It has lost so many men, and its birth rate is so low, and it has been so depopulated by refugees going to both Europe and Russia, and that it just can't. Ukrainians say, well, we can continue the fight through 2025. But that is not a strategy for victory. That is a strategy for some sort of partial survival. And I think even Mr. Zelensky now seems to understand that there is no military recovery possible of the 4 oblasts that Russia has partially annexed, that it has annexed and partially seized on the ground. Still, that's Crimea. So I think Mr. McFall is deluded.
The other conflict, Ambassador, is in Syria right now. It seems that as time goes by, the situation is getting much more complicated. Biden was bragging about the situation in Syria and saying that after all, we could overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria. But Donald Trump, it seems that he's not agreeing on that argument on the part of Biden. He says that Turkey is behind all of this. They have done this.
I think
Who's right in your opinion?
I think the Turks played a crucial role. They trained the core of the so-called HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, and they further recruited a number of Central Asians. About 30% of the HTS forces are Uyghurs, Uzbeks, other Kazakhs, others, people from Dagestan in Russia or Chechnya. The Turks were the core, but this was financed by the United States and aided and abetted by Israel. I think, there is an old saying that victory has many fathers and defeat has none. So, of course, and I think one has to remember the background here. The first U.S. effort at regime change in Syria actually took place in 1947. This is long before Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, took power in around 1970. So, and since the Assads came into power, which is now, 54 years, I guess, the U.S. has tried on multiple occasions to overthrow that regime, as has Israel. So now you said at the outset this is getting more complicated. I think it would be more accurate to say that the innate complications of Syria are becoming evident again. I mean, Syria consists of a large number of religious and ethnic communities. Alawites who have been in power, about 10, 12% of the population, Christians, Jews in Damascus still, the various kinds of Shiite sects, and of course, ethnically Kurds, Armenians, and so on and so forth. And they all hate each other. And every one of them is armed, has a militia. And every militia has a foreign backer, or maybe 2 or 3. So this has been an incredibly complicated situation, a mosaic that has now fallen apart. And here I want to say that the euphoria in the West about the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, who clearly was a very vicious dictator, very murderous regime, although he came into power with many people hoping he would reform Syria. He never did, even though all 3 of his allies, if you will, Iran, Russia, and the United and Turkey, urged him to reform constantly. And when he failed to do that, and in fact rebuffed them in some kind of deluded pursuit of a rapprochement with the Gulf Arabs and the United States, they withdrew their support. So he's now somewhere in Russia. I think he probably took a lot of money with him. So I imagine he'll be quite comfortable in Russia. But the point here is that 2 or 3 points. One, every secular regime that has fallen in the Arab world or the Muslim world generally has been succeeded by an extremist jihadi regime or by anarchy. You can think of Libya, you can think of Afghanistan, and now you can think of Yemen. And now you can think of Syria. So the idea that somehow the jihadis who took Damascus are likely to prove to be liberal Democrats in disguise is very unlikely. The second, they have a reason to want to appear reasonable, because they need to reconstruct Syria, and they also need to placate all of the different ethnic and religious communities that I mentioned. They need to try to create a Syria that is united, because Syria is not united. And that was what Bashar al-Assad discovered, that the only way to hold it together was through terror. And he created a terrorist state to do that. Well, Ahmed Shara is trying something different. But I don't believe for a minute that he has truly repented of his past behavior. And then another point is that we are seeing, despite the brave talk about how liberal democracy is going to come to Syria, we are seeing retribution. We're seeing killings. We're seeing harassment of various religious communities by jihadis. When they were in Idlib, which in the northwest of Syria, they were pretty vicious. They were very unkind to many communities. So I think the West is deluded. I hate to keep using that word, but has mistaken what is happening in Syria for something that it is not. And we do not know what the future is. Finally, of course, Israel has taken advantage of this, and Turkey is about to pursue their long-term objectives. The Israeli objective is to fragment Syria so that all of these little communities are little statelets, and they don't have any collective power to oppose Israel. That's very clear. It also wants land, and it has taken 350 square miles, I believe, maybe it's kilometers, of land that was entrusted to the United Nations as a buffer zone. And it's gone beyond that. And I see Mr. Netanyahu has now directed his troops to occupy that temporarily, he says, through 2025. But there is nothing so permanent as a temporary Israeli occupation. So it's pretty clear that Israel is engaged in a land grab as part of its Greater Israel project, by which fanatics like Bezalel Smotrich, whose eyes light up with a demonic fury when he talks about this, propose to make Israel a state that extends from the Nile to the Euphrates. And Israel has achieved a kind of military hegemony in its region, but that is an ambition that will be resisted by everyone in the region and many beyond it. So that's one factor. Then Turkey has massed troops on the border and clearly intends to go after the Syrian Kurds, who are aligned with the PKK, the Turkish Workers' Party, which is a terrorist, which practices terrorism in Turkey and is Kurdish. And so they are trying to break that connection, and they're trying to drive the Kurds back from the border. So there's a kind of buffer zone. And they are willing, apparently, to confront American troops who are illegally there to support the Kurds as they do this. So this is a mess. It was always a mess, but the elements of the mess are now becoming very hard to miss.
Today, there was a meeting between Ursula von der Leyen and Erdogan, in which Erdogan mentioned two crucial points. One of them was the sovereignty of Syria. It seems that they're not, at least as I understand it, it seems that they're not gonna capture Aleppo for Syria, because that's why he's talking about the sovereignty of Syria. I think he's talking about the way that Israel is behaving right now. And on the other hand, he said there is no place for ISIS and PKK in Syria. Do you find it right now? Are we getting to the point that we're going to have some sort of political confrontation between Turkey and Israel?
I think that's clearly in the offing. The Turks would like to have a Turkish guided unified Syria. They obviously have their own agenda in the Middle East, which has been called the Neo-Ottoman agenda. That is, having been essentially rebuffed in their 300-year quest to join Europe and Europeanize themselves, because the European Union, while Turkey has carried out the accession process and changed itself in the process, European Union, particularly the French, but many European Christians, do not want a Muslim country of the size and power of Turkey to be part of the European Union. And so the Turks, as a result, have turned south and east. They are trying to produce a pan-Turkic community in Central Asia. And this is part of their historic rivalry with Iran. And they are trying to produce a series of relationships to their south in West Asia that give them power, prestige, and a sphere of influence. And that inevitably brings them into conflict with Israel, even if there were not the Palestinian issue, which many Turks do feel passionately about. So I think Israel has taken action to destroy all of the self-defense capability of Syria, in part in anticipation of a showdown with Turkey, and that might come. So things are getting, as you said, very complicated, and this is not the happy moment that so many want to believe it is. I would say, I need to add another point, and that is, of course, the Turks also want to drive the Syrian refugees out of Turkey and back to Syria. They have the biggest refugee burden of any country in Europe and or in West Asia. And so this is a source of great tension, particularly in the border areas, places like Gaziantep in Syria. So, by the way, Nima, here's a secret I figured out for myself about Turkish. When you say Erdogan, that G with a little circle or little blip on top of it, do you know where that came from? It came from the Arabic letter Waw. And it's pronounced the same way, not like G. That's why it's Erdogan, not Erdogan. Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't know whether you read and write Persian, but I suppose you do. And so you know the letter Waw. It's like a G.
Yeah.
So when the Turks switched
They
to
don't pronounce
it's pronounced like that way. When the Turks switched to the Roman alphabet, the Latin alphabet, they kept that one letter, but they marked it with a little mark on top of it to show that it wasn't actually the Latin letter.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I can actually read Turkish as well. I talk a little
I
bit,
didn't know that.
speak Turkish as well. And the other problem, Ambassador, is right now the policy of Russia and Iran. Or can we imagine that they're just simply leaving Syria, or as Erdogan and Turkey are insisting to keep Russians in Syria? It seems that they're advocating that Russia can stay in Syria. On the other hand, we've learned that the Iranian embassy was not captured by these groups in Syria, and they're just protecting the Iranian embassy there. Do you think? Oh, go ahead.
And I think The new regime in Syria wants to keep its options open. It appears to be doing a deal with the Russians to allow them to retain their bases. This is very important for Russia because the naval base at Latakia is their frontage on the Mediterranean Sea. The air base at Khmeimim is their transit point. They're a midpoint between Russia and places like Africa. So it's a very important, it plays the role in Russian strategy that Ramstein or Frankfurt plays in the American strategy. It's a to use the American military term, it's a lily pond. You can step on it and then leap on to the next pad. This is very important to the Russians. They're not going to give up on Syria. They also have another interest, and that is precisely the one that we're not sure about. Is HTS, which is after all a kind of umbrella organization at the head of many jihadi groups, is it going to control the export of terrorism to Russia? Russia has, 15-17% Muslim population, many of whom are restive and who are open to violent politics. So Russia has a concern about the ideological complexion of Syria, but it will not give up. Iran, of course, has lost Syria as a base, as a transit point for assistance to Hezbollah. And the new government in Damascus is violently anti-Shia and anti-Iranian, and has fought the Iranian presence in Syria historically. But it looks to me as though this is still an open question, what kind of relationship Iran might have with the future government of Syria. I note that despite the fact that Hamas is also avowedly Sunni and Salafi in its inspiration, Iran had no trouble making an alliance with Hamas. So I think this is an open question. And Israel clearly thinks it's an open question, because that is one of the motivations for their destruction of the Syrian self-defense capacity.
There are two concepts right now. One of them says that resistance was defeated, Iran is defeated, Hezbollah is defeated, Israel gonna capture whatever it wants in Palestine, the West Bank, in Gaza, and they can do nothing about it. The other concept is Iran can find a solution for what's going on in Syria. Maybe they can send their weapons through Jordan and other places that they may thinking of right now. In your opinion, what is the current situation of the resistance and the people who are helping Palestinians right now and in the future?
Well, it's pretty poor. Hamas has been driven underground in Gaza. It has been badly battered. It still exists. It has not gone away, but its capacity to resist is greatly reduced. Hezbollah is in a better position, but still not a very good one, and it has lost its logistical lifeline to Iran. So the resistance, the Yemenis carry on, and they are the only party in the resistance other than the Iraqi militias who are really untouched by all this. But I think we have to recognize that we don't know what the long term will bring with it. There is no possibility that resistance to Israeli cruelties and expansion will cease. Israel creates the resistance by its actions. It did that in 1948 and before, and it continues to make enemies at a colossal rate. So we don't know what's going to happen in the future, except we can be sure that the resistance will continue. And probably, I think it's very likely that it will take the form of international terrorism against Israeli interests, Israelis, and probably Americans too, as supporters of Israel, as was the case in the 1960s, because the resistance cannot operate effectively in the occupied zone. It will go outside that zone. So that's the long term. But in the short term, we should be much more concerned about the issue of an Israeli attack on Iran in partnership with the United States. There are many reasons for Israel to strike now, not the least of which is the impact on Iran of the loss of its frontline defenders in Hezbollah and Hamas, or their incapacitation, and the loss of Syria. This removes Iran's basic deterrent factor, and Iran is left naked. So in this context, many people believe that internal Iranian politics will cause Iran to relax its religious scruples against building a nuclear weapon, and that it will do so as the only means of deterring Israel effectively. So this means for Mr. Netanyahu that he has to prevent that. And that means strike early rather than later. There's another reason. President Biden, although he has often counseled Israel against rash, violent action, has always supported it when it happened. And I'm sure Mr. Netanyahu, who has nothing but contempt for President Biden, believes that if he can create a fait accompli, an actual attack on Iran, the United States will become involved on behalf of Israel. There are, on the other hand, so he may want to strike before Mr. Trump comes into office and present Mr. Trump with a fait accompli. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, there are people in the Trump entourage who favor an American attack on Iran. And whatever uncertainties exist at present over the Biden administration's position will be erased by Mr. Trump coming into office. And don't forget, when you think about Mr. Trump, again, I mentioned that he murdered General Soleimani. This was not an act of goodwill toward Iran, nor was it an act constrained by international law. It was entirely illegal. So I think we're in a very dangerous moment in the region. Whether Israel, and even backed by the United States, could in fact do more than set back the Iranian nuclear program is an open question. Iran has had a long time to put its nuclear facilities underground in heavily protected facilities. And even if it doesn't have a bomb program, one has to assume that there are engineers, very competent engineers in Iran who could take fissile material, which Iran is almost at the nuclear bomb level, 60% enrichment. This is a logarithmic function, could very easily become 90%, which is the usual percentage for a nuclear weapon. I think the engineers in Iran are sufficiently capable to mount a nuclear warhead on one of the very fine Iranian missiles. So the danger that Iran will go nuclear is something real. The danger that therefore it will be attacked preemptively is also something real. And I think all of the ingredients for a wider war are in place.
In your opinion, is there any possibility that Iran already has nuclear bombs and we're not aware of? Because I talked with David Pine, who said has some intelligence, and he said that it's been more than 15 years that Iran has that capability. And what can we say about that?
All I can say is that both the public posture and the general intelligence assessment of Iran is that the fatwa that the Ayatollah Khomeini issued during the Iran-Iraq war, that weapons of mass destruction are haram, are forbidden in Islam, stands. That is the public posture. I believe it represents a serious religious commitment on the part of the Iranian leadership. I note that sorry, names are going out of my head, but when the chief negotiator for Iran on nuclear matters came,
Zarif.
Zarif, no, not Zarif, but the head of the Iranian nuclear program back around 1983 or so. When he took office.
It was Velayati?
No, not Velayati, I'm sorry. Anyway, I will think of the name. I'm sure I'll wake up in the middle of the night and remember it. But when he took office, his first act was to conduct a survey of all Iranian nuclear-related activity. And he discovered, to his surprise, that notwithstanding the Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa, there were in fact people working on nuclear weapons. This had started under the Shah, and it continued on a perfunctory basis, not supported by the Iranian government, but going on. And he shut it down, and he brought the actual behavior into compliance with the fatwa. So I think it's wrong to dismiss the power of a declaration like that. The other point, however, is that I'm not aware of any intelligence agency, Mossad, CIA in particular, or the IAEA, to endorse this thinking. And here I will say, there's I'll give you a story. I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War of 1990-91, and to liberate Kuwait from Iraq. And I noticed, I was getting daily intelligence reports. It was clear that Iraq had a significant chemical weapons inventory. It had a significant biological weapons inventory. And the United States and Saudi Arabia foolishly concentrated on preventing an Iraqi fighter bomber from dropping a biological weapon on Riyadh. When in fact, if you wanted to do that, all the Iraqis would have used a camel instead of a jet fighter. But I noticed the intelligence, there was no change in the facts at all. And we began the fight, which lasted, about 7 months, the war. We began the war with a firm conclusion by the intelligence agencies that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapon. It had been working on one, but it didn't have one. That was the position. The facts never changed, but the assessments became more and more in favor of it having a nuclear weapon. Why? Because that justified policies. That justified a future attack on Iraq, and it justified all kinds of precautions, and it painted Iraq as a villain who is breaking international law, and so forth and so on. And my assessment is that very likely the same thing is happening with Iran, that the facts have not changed. We know the facts. The facts are that there is a very active advanced centrifuge program to separate fissile material and produce enriched uranium. We know that the enrichment has gone to roughly 60%. We know that it's a small step from that to 90%. And so we know that Iran, in effect, despite not having a bomb program, has pursued nuclear latency. And, these are the facts as I understand them. But our political elite and the government of Israel notwithstanding what their own intelligence agencies tell them, is absolutely sure that Iran has a bomb. Why? That would justify an attack on Iran. What would happen if there were an attack on Iran? Well, Iran would be weakened, whatever happened. There might even be regime change. I don't believe so, but that is the hope of the people who advocate an attack. And you hear this, Mr. Netanyahu talking about this openly. And he has been in favor of an attack on Iran for at least a quarter century. So I'll tell you one other story. I was asked when I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, this is probably 1992 in the spring, to brief then Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdulaziz about the Iranian nuclear program. And I was given a lot of material by the CIA to do that. And they said Iran is 2 years away from building a bomb. That was in 1992. I don't see any bomb. And, now why would the Israelis be suspicious? Well, first of all, if Iran did have a bomb, that would be a threat to them. Obviously, it would be existential. Israel, despite its territorial enlargement, is a small country. It could be wiped out in a couple of nuclear blasts. I think that concern is not implausible. It's justified. But then the second point is Israel produced a bomb by lying to everyone. And it built a facility under Dimona, the research reactor that produced fissile material. It actually stole its initial batch of material from Pennsylvania. But, Israel has a lot of experience at cheating on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it naturally suspects that whatever it did, Iran could do, and probably is doing. Because, there is, in the Middle East, there is the old proverb, if you see a Persian and a snake, kill the Persian first. This is because Iranians have a reputation for being very smart and competent and quite a bit devious. There is a supposed doctrine in Iranian Shiism, which that lying is permissible under some circumstances. This is a very complicated situation, but it produces bombs in the imagination much faster than it does in Tehran.
When you look at Donald Trump right now, before 2024, during his interviews with the media, he said that the only thing that he's concerned of is the Iranian nuclear program. Do you think that with all that said, is he going to make a new war? Because the war with Iran is not going to be something
simple,
and so it's going to influence all corners of this planet, and they're going to be, and Iranians I would argue, would destroy Israel if they go in that direction. Is the United States, what's going on in the mind of Trump and his administration? Are they making these type of arguments to make a new deal with Iran, which I believe Iran is interested in making a new deal with the United States on the nuclear program? But why are they talking about attacking Iran right now?
Allahu Alam. God knows. I cannot tell you what is in the mind of Mr. Trump and his entourage. All I can tell you is that they give every signal of wanting to attack Iran. Why is this? Well, there's a lot of history on both sides, going back to the overthrow of Mossadegh on the Iranian side and the hostage taking when the Islamic Republic came into being in 1980, and so 79 and 80. So there's just a lot of bad blood. And then there is Israel, which is constantly feeding venom into the American view of Iran. So Iran has been successfully vilified in American politics. Oddly enough, I don't think the United States has been quite as vilified in Iranian politics, but that is just a reality. So I don't know, but I repeat, I think we're at a very dangerous moment. Now, if there were a war, I don't know how it would come out. I mean, wars are always gambles. They are risky. You cannot tell what the result will be. I don't believe that a nation as large and as with a history as long as Iran can be destroyed. Israel could be destroyed. I agree. That is possible. And in fact, I would argue it is destroying itself by its current actions. It has become the most hated society on the planet. It menaces the world's Jews with it to the extent that they remain sympathetic to it, and many of them are not. It menaces the world's Jews with a rebirth of anti-Semitism. It's carrying out a Holocaust. And others might think that would justify another Holocaust of the Jews. And this is really bad stuff. But I don't know in the case of a war what would happen. I think I go back to the question with which you began, the assassination of General Kirillov in Moscow. This is a sign that the global order no longer has any rules. The United States and the G7 claim that we are issuing rules, but nobody follows those, not even us. So much of the world, there are questions here. I heard the former foreign minister of Portugal, Messias, give a brilliant talk at Georgetown University recently, and it's worth watching. He gave a talk, and he talked about the differences between power. You can have a lot of power, military power, whatever power. Legitimacy, whether your use of that power is accepted by others, is a big question. And his argument is that we are in a revolutionary period, that so much of the world's rules have been broken, set aside, that there's no legitimacy anymore. People demand action, and they will do it, and they will take measures that would have been regarded in any other period as utterly unacceptable and illegitimate. So it's very hard in this context, when the kaleidoscope is being banged and the pieces are constantly rearranging themselves, to make a clear prediction. I very much hope, because I agree with you, a war between Israel and the United States on the one side and Iran on the other would shake the globe. This would be would cripple many things. And if it did go nuclear, which could entirely, if it went on for a while, that could even threaten the survival of our species. So this is something that should not happen. But at the moment, it looks very much as though it will.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Well, we ended on a sour note, did we not? But thank you for the opportunity to share my views, which may or may not be correct.
My pleasure.